we're moving on now to actually it's already the final session of the day. And we're definitely not tailing off. So we thought we'd do something slightly different. We've had one semi-panel session at the start of this afternoon. Now we've got a full panel session, and we've got an exceptional group of people who are going to have a bit of a chat about where we are as a sector from a diversity perspective, and also where we'd like to get to. And for this, I'm going to hand over to Viveen Taylor, who is Sport England's still relatively new Director of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. And she's going to chair this discussion. And she's going to be joined by Pippa Britton, who's already been name-checked once today, and rightly so, who's Vice Chair of Sport Wales and a double Paralympian. Sue Anstiss, who is CEO of Fearless Women and a trustee of the Women's Sports Trust. And also Karl George, who is an author and governance consultant and managing director of the Governance Forum. So I'm sure they'll introduce themselves properly, and so I'll just hand over to Viveen, and she can take us through this session. Afternoon, Viveen.
Hi, good afternoon, Craig, and I really hope my Wi-Fi just holds up here, but it's great to be here and welcome everyone to today's panel discussion. I really hope you've enjoyed your conference today. We are indeed the last act, but we are by no means members of any form of any graveyard shift. I'm Viveen Taylor, and I'm recently appointed, as Craig said, to the role of Director of Equality and Inclusion at Sport England, and I'm delighted to have been invited to host this session today. And I can't host a panel discussion without a panel, and I'm honoured to be speaking today with three very experienced and well-respected individuals who I'll introduce shortly, who have all agreed in conversation with me to discuss the challenges and opportunities for the sector as we continue to grapple with the way of improving diversity in the leadership of organisations. And we want to talk lots about, we all talk lots about representation and being representative of society and achieving better outcomes in decision making and social equity. But how do we really competently and confidently do that? And what do we do when we get stuck and when we're unsure, where do we go and who do we speak to? And hopefully we'll be able to respond to some of our thinking today. So really want you to try and engage with the session, drop any questions you've got into the chat. And please continue to tweet and using the hashtag that you've been given today. And we'll try our best to keep you engaged throughout the session. And so I just want to welcome our panellists, and I hope you can see me and hear me, folks, because I can see you. I want to firstly introduce Sue Anstiss, who's been a pioneer in British women's sport for over 30 years and a founding trustee of the Women's Sport Trust and a co-founder of the Women's Sport Collective, and recently appointed as a member of the RFU's new Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Group, established to support RFU to reflect the diversity in society. And I'm really encouraging people to read people's profiles, because it's just such a really interesting way to understand what people are about and the expertise in the room. And then we've got Pippa. Welcome, Pippa. Again, name checked already. I haven't been, but you may have been. Most successful archer from Wales, a double Paralympian, and has represented the Welsh able-bodied team on more than 20 occasions. His passion is working with organisations towards greater inclusion, improving equity and increasing disability awareness, all with the well-being and fairness at the heart of what you're doing. That's fantastic. Welcome, Pippa. And finally, but by no means least, we've got Karl George MBE. And Karl is a thought leader and internationally established consultant in governance, with over 20 years combined experience in accountancy, business and strategic development, amongst other things. And I think one of the interesting things of your profile, Karl, is that you are an inspiring conference speaker, often being asked to come back and host other events. So I'm a little bit under pressure here, but I'm going to try and live up to your expectations and standards. But Karl is a very intellectual speaker, very adept at delivering days, workshops, and a range of subjects, notably around corporate governance, board behaviour, trust and ethics. So welcome, panel.
Thank you.
It's great to be here today, and we're going to start our conversation. And again, I would encourage people, where they can, to drop their questions into the chat, and I will try where I can to pull these through if we don't talk about them in the main session. So we're going to start with where we are now. And earlier, I believe Perrott Laver outlined the advantages of diverse boards. And there may still be organisations that are still not sure why changes and why diversity is really good and why it's good for business. And we know that it improves decision making amongst other things. But what is the real business case for progressing with change, and why is it so important in this context? And so, can I open the discussion with you on that question, and I'll come to the panel members.
Of course, yes. Thanks, Viveen. Actually, it's been an amazing day today. I've learnt stuff in the Perrott Laver session this morning too. I do feel often we think we know, working in this space, in terms of the commercial advantages of having a diverse board and a management team, from all that research we've seen in the past from McKinsey and others. But I think elements around moving more so now in terms of media scrutiny and how staff feel about the organisations in which they work. So that, I would say, reputation really, I think, whether it's sports trying to attract sponsors, and as they look to attract more players too. So I think there are many reasons beyond those that we first think in terms of why it's so important to have that diverse board, and then how it filters down across the organisation, which I'm sure we'll talk about more in the future. But yeah, for me, it's about telling the stories and sharing the success stories of where it is making a difference to businesses and sport.
And in terms of, I know Perrott Laver led that work around gender initially. Do you think there's been a kind of an impact and a real connect with the business case for increasing diversity for women specifically?
Yeah, well, there has, and it's interesting, isn't it? I think if you look at from the previous code of governance, in terms of, we've seen that lovely shift in terms of gender balance on boards, but that doesn't really extend. And I know this isn't necessarily the remit of Sport England and UK sport, but in terms of commercial professional sport. So there was some fantastic research year before last, I think, from Farrer & Co, looking at professional sports clubs, so football, cricket, rugby. I think only about 3% of them met the 30% target. I think 11 Premier football clubs don't even have a single woman on any of their boards. So I think we have got much better in many places across sport. And I often worry that it's a bit that tick box. We've got to our 30%, we've got our two, whatever the size of our board is, we've got our 2 females, we're okay now. And therefore, I was fascinated to hear some of that discussion this morning about that, focusing on a skills-based board. So we're open to all people from all backgrounds. It's not just gender that we need to shift there.
Okay, thank you.
Could I?
Yeah, of course, Karl. Come on in.
Yeah, when we talk about business case, and I work across private, public, and voluntary sector, and one of the first things I think about is really how we get competitive advantage. And the last session I was just listening to, all about resilience, means that we've got to have the right competency of people around the boardroom table so that we are competitive and we can take advantage of all the skills that we've got. So the business case, and you did mention, Sue, about McKinsey, and a lot of the time when we talk about diversity, the McKinsey reports talked about gender first of all, and says that those companies outperform companies that are not as diverse. And more recently has also talked about ethnic diversity. So not just gender, but ethnicity as well. So the whole idea of having people from different skills, different backgrounds, means that you outperform. And then that's linked to Moody's recently talking about boards, that if they have more diversity on their boards, then it actually impacts their credit profile. So when you see the private sector doing that, you know that there's a reason why they think of that. And a couple more, NASDAQ, would you believe, have said that to be listed, you will have to have 2 directors from diverse backgrounds. And we know about McGregor Smith, which says full representation gives us £24 billion. So there's enough now to match the moral case with the business case, and also looking at what we do in sports.
Yeah, and I think there's so much we can learn from other sectors around this, Karl. I think you're absolutely right. I lost some of what you were saying. I think it was my internet, but I gathered most of it. That bottom line, sometimes the pound and pence in the corporate sector is actually sometimes key.
It's about the future as well, isn't it?
The progress.
I think it's about the future of organisations, and the if you have a diverse board, it can be reflected within the leadership of the organisation, then within the actual workforce of an organisation, and that, I think, there's that whole kind of, if you can see it, you can be it. And then you've got a whole generation of kids who are growing up and thinking, maybe I can be, an engineer or a banker or whatever it happens to be. So it isn't as simple as just saying, well, this is how we're going to affect the governance of an organisation. It's the way that the governance affects the people who work within the organisation and the people who want to be part of that organisation. And that might even be in sport, for example, where you're actually encouraging kids to become more active because they want to take part in sport because it's reflective. So I think there's a whole thing going on here, isn't there, about looking to the future as well as how this is affecting us right at the moment.
Absolutely, and it's that almost like that kind of, as you say, see to be it, but the kind of ability to see yourself in that role, but also it brings you like young leaders that kind of want to drive that as well, the kind of younger people that are thinking, I want to do this, I want to be part of this, and they kind of generate themselves. There's a moral imperative basically to do better and to do more. So I think that's really important. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to move on now onto in terms of how the current moment, a defining moment for most of us. It's been a really challenging year for more reasons than one. And diversity is featured prominently on all sorts of social media platforms, and also socially in terms in the media as well as playing out on our streets socially. But we kind of look at the significant issues that have impacted our communities, particularly with the pandemic. And it's forced a lot of organisations, a lot of companies to think differently about diversity, think differently about inclusion. And Karl, I'm going to come to you to start us here. But how do the panel think, in terms of how we can use this moment to create lasting, sustainable beyond the words and beyond the statement?
Thanks, Vivian. I'm going to come from it from two perspectives. I'm going to start with governance because I'm the guy who gets tingly about corporate governance. And I'm going to say, so when I look at governance, what I'm thinking is, if we go back to 2011 and we looked at what happened with gender diversity and the Davis report and how organisations decided that we get the 30% club now, we see that there's been a movement over the last decade. We've got a moment in history where we want to think about how can we contain and also gain with that momentum. So I started to think about, what about all the recommendations, reports, pledges that people have got? And shouldn't we have a governance code? Shouldn't we have something that enables us to demonstrate how we're going to be accountable? And if you look at all the revisions, again, across sectors, whether it's housing, sport, the charity sector, one of the major influences to all governance codes updates has been the whole equality, diversity, and inclusion. So we're at that tipping point. Remember Malcolm Gladwell's book? We're at that tipping point where we're able to, if we pull all of this together, see real transformational change. So I don't want to be speaking to my children about the same thing that I was going through, which I've had to do with my teenage son. If we can do something now and we use that tipping point, we can actually go forward with this new era that says diversity, and we'll talk about cognitive diversity later on, but this diversity of age, of gender, of ethnicity is really what we need to be resilient and sustainable and be competitive. So in terms of what do we do about this moment, I think we've got to grab it with both hands, because I don't know if we're going to get an opportunity like this where we've got the awareness, we've got the attention, and we've got the empathy and sympathy of so many people to really make a change with allies and with people that should be looking at how we make the best for our organisations.
And that's kind of into society as well, and that can quite often we're not connected in the same way. We're kind of working at it in silos most of the time. We think about it sometimes as a whole individual, but most of the time we're working about it in silos, not necessarily connecting all of that up. And how do we kind of use the kind of moment? And sport has its role to play. It is not the panacea, it is not the answer, but how do we use sport can we use sport in a way that kind of helps that diversity? Kind of that connect in that moment and building that moment, Pippa?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about sports, of course, is that actually we have probably more representation in a kind of athlete community. By the time you've got lots of women who are taking part and you've got, Paralympians out there, so lots of people with disabilities, and also you've got people from all sorts of different ethnic backgrounds. So I think sport has actually got a little bit of a head start on other areas of society. And in some instances, we're just a bit more prepared to talk about these things. And that's not true for every aspect of sport. But because we've already been down a journey where we've had sports that have been gender specific, for example, and women have said, well, do you know what, we can play rugby and football just the same as anybody else can. I think we've started having conversations earlier than some other aspects of society, which gives us a bit of a head start. It also means that we can use what's happening at the moment, which is actually opening things up for discussion. So if we're already further down the discussion route or further down the journey, then we have more opportunities to have those conversations. And I think it's one of the things that I found particularly is, although that there are traditional sports who have been harder to shift, and undoubtedly there's always people in life who are harder to shift. It's not just with sport. Although that's true, I think for the most part, the fact that there are sports governance codes, for example, there are an awful lot of people who see those codes as an opportunity to change behaviour and to recognise that there are parallels between behaviour in the boardroom, for example, and how well an organisation is run. So I think that's the thing, is kind of almost reflecting some of what Karl has said as well around that sort of behavioural piece, to get people living and breathing this rather than just kind of putting it in a drawer and ticking a box and hoping it goes away. So I think we're just in a different space.
Okay, thank you. And George, and I know you've got another point that you wanted to bring. You wanted to come in on two fronts. But before we do, Sue, is there anything you want to add here before I bring Karl back in?
I just agree, and that sport can be so powerful in terms of its cultural power, and the fact that we've got sports headlines on every news bulletin, newspaper, radio, that it kind of covers society in a way that many other sectors don't. So I do think we have an opportunity to set an example. But clearly, as Pippa mentioned, with so many of those sports, the history of being very white male dominated and run through committees and volunteers, and that's fed up to the boards almost. I think that is something that, whilst we've made great advances there, that's still a challenge for many of those sports, as we look both at the top down and the bottom up too, in terms of where people are seeking their board directors from.
Okay, thank you. So Karl, I'm going to bring you back in.
Yeah, I reflect actually. I run a leadership program. It's called the Effective Board Member Program. Started with young leaders, and in fact, it started with me trying to get black men to volunteer to go onto boards. It's across the whole sector now. But did you know that over the last few years, we've done about 300 young leaders now? We find that women are the ones who are now enrolling onto this program more than men. And I actually I find it difficult to get the men, because it's a Saturday morning for half a day with these young leaders. So most of the time, that's what we do. We do a similar program with football. So we've got a contract with the PFA. So we've done about 150 footballers, and we're trying to change the diversity in the boardroom by getting them trained up in this corporate governance, how to be effective, and then getting them into the boardroom. And the reason I mention those programs, because I'm seeing more and more interest in people understanding that they can make a change by getting into the leadership. And these are people from more and more diverse backgrounds. Coming back to what you were saying about the present moment, I think we have got that opportunity. We have got an opportunity to say, let's make a change now by getting people interested. And forgive me, by getting tingly about corporate governance and tingly about leadership and getting tingly about making change, because I really believe it starts at the top, filters its way through. And Sue and Pippa, you both mentioned actually reputation as well. What they see is what they'll be is something I used to say in a mentoring organisation I was involved in. And if we want to change the culture, if we want to change how they behave, we need to change what they see as well. So what they see reflected in the boardroom in your organisation will actually translate into whether they feel they can trust, whether they feel they can be a part of, or they feel they can influence your organisation.
Yeah, it's interesting you use that word trust, and that's very important in terms of, you know, kind of getting the buy-in. If, you know, with not just with your brand, but with your organisation, what it does, how it feels to be engaged with the organisation as well. So trust is genuinely a key point. So thank you. We are getting some questions in the chat, and I will come to them. So just keep them going. But I'm just going to move on to our next question and discussion point, which is around what should we be aiming for, and how much more is left to do, and how do we get there? And I think it's one of those things, you know, how do we ensure we focus on more than one issue when we talk about diversity? It's really easy to fall into default into race, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it is more than that. So I'm going to call you, Pippa. Do you want to start us in terms of what that means, what else is important here to think about and to consider?
Yeah, I mean, this is anybody who talks to me at any length of time is gonna know this is a topic that is very close to my heart. Obviously, some of you will notice my wheelchair behind me, so I'm one of the 20% or 20 odd percent of people in this country who've got a disability, and so, you know, I see underrepresentation within my own group. Then I see things like, you know, the focus on women that we've had over recent years, and more recently, you know, and rightly so, some focus on Black Lives Matter, which, you know, there's been other groups as well that I kind of feel have been left out of the equation. My big thing about this is, my fear is for a lot of organisations is that they focus on visible diversity. So they are going to say, well, we'll have Pippa come along because Pippa's got a wheelchair. We'll have Karl come along because Karl's skin isn't the same colour as my skin, you know, and we can see that these people are diverse. But actually what we really, really need in the boardroom is we need diverse background of thought and diverse background of experience. And I mean, I bring a lived experience of disability, and Sue's going to bring a different lived. Everybody who is here today listening to this brings a different lived experience. And the challenge that we face very often is that if we were to pick, you know, there's a friend of mine who said to me, if we pick a black man and an Asian man and a white man, and they all went to Eton and grew up next door to each other, then actually that is probably no more diverse than having just three black men or three white men or three whatever men or women who went to Eton. I don't know if women go to Eton, sorry. But my point being that we really need to make sure that we think about the reflection of everybody in society, not just those people who, when we get a picture in our head of a place where a person will park their car who has a disability, has a picture of a wheelchair, you know, not all disabled people use wheelchairs, and we don't all have the same background. So that's my fear sitting alongside all of this, so is that we will lose sight of why do we want diversity in our boards. We want diversity in our boards because we want the best skills, we want the best people, we want the greatest breadth of experience so that we can make the best decisions. And the reason we want to make the best decisions, whether you're in sport or you're in business, is if it's in sport, you want to make the best decisions so that some kid can get out on their skateboard or their bike or play football on a Saturday morning. And that's what we want to do. And if you're in business, you want to make money. So, you know, the reality is it's about us being the best. And how do we achieve that? And we mustn't lose sight of all of those things, but it's that kind of widest representation. And I do appreciate I've gone on for some time. So I'll
such a fantastic point though, isn't it? And I think the piece from today, I've learned so much today. I think there is that whole, we've talked about being uncomfortable in the not necessarily getting it right in terms of language and approach. And so I'm making notes, even if Pippa's talking here, I'm thinking, you know, have we gone through the process on board? Sometimes it's a bit of a tokenistic, not completely tick box, but we've done it and we feel we are therefore more representative. But actually, is it a diverse thought and background, and some of the things we heard this morning in terms of education, all those areas. So no, it's fascinating, Pippa.
Can I just?
Right, you've created a few questions. You've created a few questions in the chat, Pippa. I'll pick up in a moment. But Karl, please do come in.
Yeah, I was going to say I think there's 3 generations of governance and of boardroom behaviour, and I have to be careful sometimes because the first generation said just get me a non-exec, somebody who's different, and that's it. The second generation started to look at, well, I need an accountant or a lawyer or a HR, and didn't really look at age, gender, and ethnicity, but started to do that. And I find myself recently arguing about cognitive diversity. And the reason I want to say a bit of caution is I think there are layers. So the first layer is the independent non-executive. The next layer is getting these functional responsibilities in. So you're not just the accountant on the board, you look at the whole area. We do want age, gender, and ethnicity and disability. We do want to look at all of that. And then the next layer starts to look at that socio-demographic. It starts to look at cognitive diversity, but not to the detriment of the other layers, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's so complicated. So I was making this argument, and people thought I was saying, no, I don't need ethnic diversity anymore. And I'm saying, nah, we still got to get that proportion right. We've still got to hit representation, but it's much more complicated. And I love your analogy than just replacing a white man with a black man with the same demographic background. Yeah. It's much more complicated than that, but we still got to look at representation because that's how we get that different lived experience being spoken about in the boardroom.
I think, Karl, as well, it also gives you the it also gives again a platform, doesn't it, for people coming behind you? It's because they kind of there's very often a situation of, I don't think that's for me, and if you'd have asked me 20 years ago or something, would I ever be interested in governance, I'd have said, oh God, no, that's a room full of stuffy old men in suits, isn't it, talking endlessly about nothing. And yet here I am now, being really passionate about it. So, and some of that is because I've seen other people lead the way.
Yeah. It's that tingly feeling, Karl. I think we're all getting it now.
Yeah, we all have that, won't we? Yeah.
We're all getting it. So that's great. And I think there is something around that lived experience and how we are using that more now. In this time, in that momentum, but also about in terms of what more we can do, which is quite straightforward. But I'm going to move over to some of the questions in the chat now, some really good ones. I think we should give them some time. Got a question here from Laddie, and just let me know if you want to answer this one, any of the panel members. We see diversity in sports, in professional sports in North America, with lots of franchises and governing organisations that have women and ethnic diverse people in C-suite positions. Why does the panel think that this is not reflected in the UK, given the evidence that Karl has just stated? So obviously back to what you said earlier around representation. Why do you think it's not the same here in the UK as it is in North America?
Can I just jump in first, just to reinforce the point I made earlier, which I think is that historical clubs, committees, constituent bodies, there's a real kind of hierarchy of where people progress to get onto those board positions. So if you take rugby union as an example, but it will take you years and years to progress through being a volunteer, being on a committee, to progress your way through to the boards. And I think that's probably that long established history that perhaps with some of the franchises on commercial sport in the States, it hasn't been so much people coming through as players and volunteers and coaches. I feel that might be the case.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Karl, do you want to add something?
Yes, I'd echo that actually, but also thinking about the talent pipeline, or which we'd say in private sector, but talent pipeline in this sector. Where are the people coming from who are going to enter into these boards? And sorry, I'm not about the governance of how you get elected. Some of the times the elections come from popularity. It comes from the same constituency of people that look like each other. And we all have got those biases that we recruit to what we like. We would say that person, not because of competence, but because of likability, has been elected to a particular position. So how do we break that barrier? How do we make sure that the structures that are in place enable us to get people on the board, and that might be shadowing, that might be reverse mentoring, it may be a number of different ways that we can, and as you quite rightly said, Pippa, is getting people to see that there are people like me sitting in these positions, which means I want to pursue a career in this area. So I think that's what we might see, and we may be a little bit behind. I'm quite surprised to hear that internationally the statistics are different. I'd probably think that they're not that much different if I was to look empirically across the different sectors. And perhaps there's a few commercial entities that have taken this on board a lot more, because in the States they have a bit more of a rules-based approach to certain things, and we're a bit more principle-based in the UK, waiting for the principals to sort this out, and waiting for our good nature.
I think there's something else as well. We hear a lot about the deep divisions that there are in American society, but the reality is it's really quite a young country, and everybody's got a granny who came from, you know, either Germany or Ireland or the Caribbean or wherever it happens to be, and I think that because of that, they don't look at they don't have the same kind of traditions. There's just a greater mix of people in the society, whether they're people who've got a German, Polish, Caribbean, Asian background. So I think they're starting from a different starting point from us. And I noticed somebody's put something in the chat around the Croquet Society, Croquet Association. My apologies, but it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because you know, when people think about that, they're thinking about long traditions. And actually, if you think about baseball, you're not thinking about long traditions in the same way. And so I think it's very difficult for us to compare sport in the two societies when, for one, it's a family experience where everybody, you know, people go to the Super Bowl and they'll spend, you know, all day with their whole family. And perhaps in this country, you'll get groups of young men going to watch football together because it has just a different cultural history that goes along with it. So I think it can be quite dangerous for us to try and compare ourselves with other places.
Okay, thank you. Laddie, I hope that's answered your question or got at least you thinking about it differently. There's a very similar question from Terry around, can the panel give thoughts, experience on challenging solutions to managing diversity? And I think it's more around, once you get people there, how do you keep them there? That's sustaining them there. And I suppose, you know, any thoughts on how you can make it feel real rather than we talked a little bit about it not being a tick box and that the actual experience is valuable. How can organisations manage that?
I think there's something about support here, which this is, you know, and first and foremost is about making people feel welcome and good inductions, you know, being just generally inclusive of everybody, removing some barriers along the way. So as somebody with a disability, you know, I constantly have to phone ahead and find out whether the meeting room's going to have stairs or whatever it happens to be. So as an organisation, if somebody phones me up and says, by the way, there aren't any stairs here, for me, that makes me feel included because the barrier has been removed. You actually get quite fed up with asking for things when you're disabled. With a disability, you get fed up with asking for people to get things off the top shelf or for a ramp to get here. So if someone offers it to you, that removes that barrier straight away. There are also things like if you've got somebody who comes from a poorest socioeconomic background, for example, you might think about offering expenses for interview, expenses to attend meetings. So things like that, when they're offered up front, I think provides a level of support that makes people feel included rather than them feeling like they have to go cap in hand and ask for something. And then I think there's something around just making sure that they get if they have skills gaps, that you give them the support to fill those gaps. And if they're people who aren't quite at the level that they need to be yet, so the people who come in front of you for interview and you go, oh, you're not quite there yet, then what you really need to do is be able to support those people so that they can be there soon. You don't just send them away and go, sorry, you didn't make it this time. So it's around thinking about the equitable solutions for the person who's in front of you.
Yeah, it's that whole experience, isn't it? You don't want to, you're going to get them there, and then, you know, part experience, the interview was great, meeting the panel was great, but actually being in the board meeting or in the room or in making a decision was awful. I suppose it's the whole experience of someone wanting to be there and then kind of want to try and bring someone else along and say, actually, it was a really good thing, it worked for me, and I've got great experience as a result of it. Anything anyone wants to add before I go to the next question?
I was just going to say, I wonder whether actually with Zoom meetings, and many of the board meetings I'm on now on Zoom, but actually that does help in terms of accessibility. I know the times that people hold board meetings may affect, people's backgrounds and where they're working, etc. So I think that accessibility of more boards moving to, if not all board meetings, but some, may definitely help in the future. So thinking about, accessibility both in terms of physically into buildings, but also the time and availability of people to travel across the country to get to places too.
Brilliant, thank you.
Sue and Pippa, exactly what I was going to say if I had my checklist. But the one thing I'll add, and you may have been the disabled board member or the woman board member, but I've been a black board member. So something happens and all of a sudden they turn to Karl, and Karl's got the idea for the whole black community. So I obviously haven't. But what I would say, actually, in terms of a more serious point, is that sometimes taking out time to listen, to learn, and if you're a black board member or a young board member, and there's only one of you on the board, actually sometimes that can feel a little bit pressurized. Or you're the only woman on the board. So what we need to do is take time as board members to understand and get an appreciation of what it might be like for someone else in terms of their contributions in the boardroom. And even inducting and bringing people in is valuing different skills sometimes. So the way we might traditionally get someone on the board looking at their CV, we may have to look at different skills sometimes, which are equally reliable in determining how good someone's going to be in the boardroom, and then use those values to bring and get a right composition of board members. So I think it's the other thing, to keep people there. We have to make sure the environment comfortable in the right way, because board meetings shouldn't really be comfortable, should they? They should be challenging and stretching, but comfortable so that you can get the best out of people.
Absolutely, totally agree with Karl. Can't agree with you any more. I can't agree less, really. More, sorry. Just a question, a quick one from Yashmin Haroon, who also says, hello, Karl, nice to see you. How important are lived experience versus education and professional experience within the boardroom? Something you raised earlier, Pippa, around that lived experience. How important are the lived experiences versus the education professional? Should we be hierarchical? Should we be looking at lived experience above anything else?
I wouldn't say so. I think we're talking about, blended individuals here, aren't we? We're talking about the best people. So that will all be part of your whole. I certainly don't think that everybody needs to have a degree. I don't have a degree, so I have to say that, don't I? No, I think that if somebody is intelligent and interested and cares, and brings experience from, either the lived part of their lives, the working part of their lives. I think it's the right thing is to get the best fit, a person who can work well with other people around the board table, who can be challenging but supportive. There's a whole list of, and I know Karl is going to back me up on this, there's a whole list of skills that are so important that you need to be able to consider all of the kind of options that, again, bringing it back to that whole thing of why are we all in the boardroom? We're all there to make a difference to the people who are on the ground, either, running our sports or participating or whatever. And so that's what it is really, is I don't think you can value necessarily one thing above another, because you're talking about a group of people working together as a team to get the best outcome for the people at the end of the chain. And so no, I don't think you can put one thing above another.
Thank you, Karl.
If I'd add to that, it was Carver that said boards are incompetent groups of competent individuals. You see what happens when we bring people together, we sometimes find it difficult for them to work effectively together. So I wouldn't have a hierarchy of skills and expertise because every organisation is different and all the needs are different, and the service users or beneficiaries or people, your members, are all going to be different. What I would say is that we look at how we get the balance right, how we get the competency right by determining what we need in a particular environment. Sometimes actually lived experience with a particular type of charity may be the most important thing that you need to have. In other cases, it may be because of the financial nature, treasury management, that you need to have someone who understands money, if that makes sense. So I wouldn't simplify it by saying let's have a hierarchy, but let's get the balance right. Let's look at each circumstance in its own right and say, this is how we get the composition of the board to be effective for this organisation.
And the value in that is immense, really, in getting that right. I think the value, I think we talked about earlier about the business case, but actually the better decisions, the informed decisions, the kind of the pathway for other leaders to come through, it all plays out if you get all of those things right in the right way. So I think there's, Sue, is there anything you want to add before I go to what I think will be the last and final question?
No, I was just going to comment on that myth that the talent isn't out there, and I think we heard that a little bit in some of the sessions earlier today, that we can't find the right people. But sometimes that's around the language and that, that getting the pack right in terms of what you're looking for. And I think that whole, not necessarily need to be a graduate. You don't need a whole range of things, but getting that language right to make it inclusive, so people do feel they can throw their hat into the ring in the first place, I think is just so important.
Okay, Hannah, we're going to go to the final question. This is a good one. I like this one. I get asked it all the time. So unconscious. It's Yemi's question, I think. Yeah, it's Yemi's question. It's been recently been claimed that unconscious bias training is ineffective. What does the panel think about this, and what are their thoughts on other training topics that might be available to improve EDI awareness and knowledge within an organisation? I'm a host, so I'm not going to answer.
I don't mind starting on this one. I think what organisations do sometimes is try and use a plaster to fix something that needs some root cause analysis. And education is different from training. So if we were to go into an organisation and say, let's look at the education framework, let's look at how we make sure we've got psychologically safe environments for people to thrive, we then come up with the tools that help us to get there. One of the tools might be that you need to do some unconscious bias training and follow up once you've done it. Another tool may be some focus groups or diversity panels. But we use all the different tools to enable us to create a framework, an education framework that's palatable for everybody. So I don't think that the question, unfortunately, isn't the right question, because unconscious bias training may work in a particular circumstance as part of an overall strategy to deal with a particular challenge. But just using it isolated without it being part of a comprehensive EDI business-led approach doesn't work. It's got to be integrated, and we've got to look at education as a general flavour of what we're going to do.
Okay, and Sue, anything you want to add?
I think I would reflect that. I'm sure there's lots of people here who've done some unconscious bias training, and of course, then it comes down to what's the quality of the training as well. I did something relatively recently that was all online, and I came out of it as being incredibly biased towards people with a disability, which I thought was quite interesting. Against people with a disability. And I think it was one of those things that said, press the left key on your keyboard if you agree with it, and press the right key on your keyboard if you disagree with it. And half the time I was like, that my left or is my right? Oh no, I didn't mean to do that. Or like, so it was not that that I have any kind of prejudice towards people with disabilities, but I perhaps don't know my left from my right, and the quality of the training was quite poor. So there's that I would add, but there's also something around something that Karl mentioned about the safe space, that if you're going to have any kind of education and training for people around subjects that they don't know whether they have any bias towards a different group or another group, or whether or not they have prejudices they're not aware of, then actually creating a safe environment in which people can talk to each other, I think, is a really powerful thing, and probably the most important thing, because you need to be able to be comfortable about talking about difficult subjects, whatever they happen to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the key things in terms of talking about difficult subjects. It's never easy, but that's a key thing for me this year, is that challenge, putting yourself in that uncomfortable place and staying there and being okay being there. Sue, anything you want to add finally to that?
I haven't got masses to add. They're both brilliant, these panelists, aren't they? I guess just seeing it filter down from a board then into the coaching environment and into management, general management and so on. So I think definitely that safe space and having those conversations about what we feel makes a great elite coach or a great CEO, etc. So beyond the board, hoping that would filter then through to the entire organisation in sport.
Okay, that's great. Okay, well, I think I've gone over time. Is that good, Karl? I think that's a good thing. I can't argue with that myself. I think that's been a great thing. It's been
I'm definitely more
great.
I'm definitely more tingly about governance than I was at the beginning. That's good.
Great.
Yeah, it's catching, Karl. It's definitely catching. But thank you. I think it's been a really good conversation. Thank you to everyone that's dropped a question in the chat. I've tried really hard to get to them all, but they're so deep, they're so meaningful, and I hope you've got something from that. But great questions, and thank you, everybody. I'm going to hand back over to Craig now.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, everybody. Sue, Pippa, Karl, Viveen, thank you so much. That discussion was everything I knew it would be. And I knew it would be an absolutely fantastic way to end today's proceedings. And thank you for going over. That means I've got 5 minutes less to fill than I would have had otherwise, which is always very welcome.